This Sounds Better, an audio engineering podcast for everyone.
Welcome back to the This Sounds Better podcast with Miles Walker, Jason Kingston, and myself, Alex Toomey. Today we're going to be talking about something that we've kind of touched on in a little way along the ways, but now we want to focus on it. We want to talk about what makes an engineer good and how we do our best work as engineers. And to start, I think we should talk about tracking, obviously, because that is what most engineers are doing, and preparedness.
Well, like you said, I think there's a lot of different things that make engineers good, but one of the main cornerstones for me is keeping up with the pace of the session. I know I've said it before, but thinking about things like preparedness is going to help you keep the creative flow of the session going. Thinking a little bit about, like, what are you going to do when you get in the studio that day? Are we going to be doing vocals? Are we going to be doing drums? And any kind of communication you can have ahead of time with the producer. I know things will change right when you get in there because, you know, people are creative. They might come in with a game plan and you got to switch it up. But if you can have some conversations before the session gets going about goals for the session, as an engineer, you can work with what you've got set up in the studio, talk to your assistant about things that might be coming up, and really plan ahead for whatever's going next.
Anything I could tell you about preparing for a session I learned from Jason and working with Jason and assisting for Jason while he engineered for Ben. So as far as session setup and getting everything ready, Jason, what do you do to make sure you're ready for a tracking session?
Frequently, I'm going to go look at the artist. Now, if I've worked with them, then I'll have some idea of it. If I haven't worked with them, I'm going to try and get in touch with the producer, or if I'm the person producing, I'm going to go back and try and listen to previously done material or try and establish some idea of what even could be any possible feasible realm of shit that we're going to do that day. Right. So if we're doing drums, I've got drums, but I'm almost never setting up for the bare minimum requirement. I'm almost always going to if we're cutting drums, there's going to be multiple rigs set up, plus some vocals, maybe a keyboard station in the control room, like that, so that no matter what we're doing, it's a pretty quick pivot to get to whatever the next task would be.
I got something kind of in line with that too, because often I don't know exactly everything we're going to do. I might set up like a base level option for each one of those things. Like I'll always have a keyboard set up. We might want to do real piano, but at least in the moment, there's a way for somebody to play some keys real quick, get an idea down. A vocal, maybe we're doing a final keyboard vocal and we got to switch the microphone, but there's a simple microphone set up in the corner so somebody can do a quick, rough sketch of an idea. I like to have all those options set up ahead of time, even if they're not the final engineering choice, just to keep that creative stuff going.
I think with, for me, when I'm recording in rap, that's a good point. Is, normally you at least have to have two mics set up now so that if someone wants to record in the room or if they want to record in the booth, there's options. Now you can go in and you can move it back and forth and do all that, but then it's just more work for you in the moment when you're trying to focus on being a good engineer. And on top of that, you're also always going to have a producer in the room, and you're going to want to be able to set them up for whatever their interface or production rig needs.
Now, I got a question. When you're saying you use two mics, I do that too, because I have noticed sometimes people like to do it in the booth and sometimes they like to do it in the room. And if you don't know where they're going to end up, let's say you got one vocal chain you're really pumped up about, maybe it's one you picked up for the artist, where will you choose to put it first?
The booth. Unless
gotcha.
I know for sure, and I know the trend now is to be in the room. So I might just set up in the room, but for the most part, I'm hoping they'll be in the booth because I just know it'll give me a better signal. And
for sure,
that makes my life easier in general.
I think that so much of this is about trying to set up all this infrastructure, and you're trying to forward think about anything that's going to happen, and you get in the middle of it, and none of that shit fucking matters because everyone changed their fucking mind, and every last conceivable thing you had thought of and being hyper planned and meticulous means fuck all. I've definitely been in the situation of being I'm going to record this 4-piece band and we're going to have some vocals. And all of a sudden it's there's 7 horn players and fucking all of their friends and girlfriends have showed up and they're doing background vocals live on the floor. And now I'm running in and out of the room during fucking takes to like move microphones to compensate for, shit, the saxophone player decided to move across the room. This has literally happened. And like you're just trying to catch a note of it just because it's a wild scene in the tracking area and you're staying on top of it and adapting.
I think that also goes into making your setup choices, because if you fully know that that could be a possibility, and like you said, often is the possibility, having setups that are modular where like maybe you could break down part of it. And by breaking down part of it, you can pivot to strings to horns or strings to backgrounds. And it's like, cool, some of the other stuff can say set up. I didn't have to totally rechange my IO in Pro Tools, or I didn't have to use up all my good mics in one area. Being able to break down little parts as stuff changes in the session, I think is really, really helpful for you to keep pace and make those pivots quickly, but not really compromise the sound quality of whatever you're trying to record in that moment.
For sure. And actually, even like one little tip, if I'm recording something I think I need 24 channels, I always open up 32. And I will record those blank channels because I can always patch something to that channel analog and not have to cut my record. I can always just keep tracking and throw a different mic up or patch in an effect or whatever I want to on that channel and have it be live without having to stop anyone.
And I think it's important just in general when we're talking about session setup to remember that your DAW is just a toolbox. Everything else is just a tool. It's just something you need to be ready to use. And whatever you need to do to set yourself up for success in that way is what you need to be doing. So for example, like when I'm recording vocals, like I have a template for Pro Tools, but there's no settings. It's not like, oh, I have all my stuff ready to go and it's a drag and drop mix process. I just have myself ready to work so that when it comes down to it, I don't have to be routing everything in the middle of my session. I have my vocals set up so I can like subgroup them. I have everything set up so I can just drop my drums into one aux and drop everything else into another aux and get everything just looking nice and feeling the way I want it to feel immediately. And no matter what happens in the session, I'm going to be ready to get the sound that I need to get.
In that idea of talking about working within your DAW, what you can do, and I'm sure a lot of people know this, is have template sessions. And again, like Alex said, it is a lot less about like making sure the plugins are with your sound settings. Forget that, but just having imported tracks that have the right name on it.
Right.
You're going to be recording piano, have an input already dedicated to piano, and the track's called piano. That means, you can import that track, record piano, likewise with drums. That'll save you a lot of time, and that's literally just like a labeling-based thing, but will really help you stay organized and focused in that creative session when you're putting it all together.
Also, you have to think about the next person that's going to be working on it. And I think people don't care. I get so many sessions that are just labeled audio 1.2.386 whatever. And then every track is just audio dot whatever. And I'm like, what was the intention of this audio that you have? What was the intention of these vocals? Like, sometimes it's easier than others to see because, if it's just a sporadic thing, it's going to be an ad lib, but if it's identical to the lead and there's no like demarcation that one's the lead and one's not, I might make some sort of creative change that I shouldn't make.
For sure. I get really nerdy style with it too, and even use color coding. And then when I pass my tracking session on to somebody else, there's a README file in it that's like, these colors indicate lead vocals. And it's also notated in the track name, but like, I get super square with it because I like whoever's working on the project next, whether it's an additional tracking engineer for more parts or a mix engineer, if it's not me for whatever reason, to have the clearest understanding of what happened in that tracking session. Because like you said, that can be like where a lot of creative choices are made, and those choices need to get passed on to whoever is going to work on the project next so they know. And
I think just making sure that your intentions were received by the next person is 100% of how good music gets made.
Well, and so much of the labeling thing to me is so much of a courtesy. And you know this, Alex, because you've seen me lose my fucking mind about this exact thing where like people don't tell you what a left and right signal is. So something like a piano, right? Like, well, in theory, it's left and right. But if you really think about it, it's bass and treble depending on how you've mic'd the piano. right?
Right.
And depending on what the piano is, sometimes those strings cross each other, and that can get really confusing. Or like with the drum set, like someone's going like, oh, I've got my overhead left and right signal. It's like, well, who's fucking left and right?
Yeah, which perspective?
Is it
drummer
Phil Collins
or the room?
or like fucking some right-handed drummer? Like who the fuck is doing this? You know? So like label it in a way that's not just left and right. Like say what the best option is.
This is just a quick question for Jason. Do you prefer drummer perspective or audience perspective when you're doing your panning and your recording?
Oh, drums. Every time.
Oh, really? See,
Hats
I
on the
always
left.
had always heard you should choose audience perspective because if you do a sync back to picture and you watch them do the fills, it would go the opposite direction on the sync. But, obviously anybody who plays drums is always like, oh, it's got to be drummer because it feels more natural to me. So I just like that it's an interesting thing that people choose.
In regards to the sync back to picture, the day that I actually have to worry about syncing my like album recorded music back to picture, and I'm in such a lucky state that I'm getting paid with those kind of things, then yeah, maybe I'll fucking pan an audience. But outside of that, I don't give a fuck.
I mean, and you could always just, use the drummer's perspective in his headphone mix and switch it back to the other way.
Yep.
In
there you go.
The mix. And I think that brings us to our next topic, which is setting up headphone mixes and setting up what the artist needs to hear to perform the best.
I mean, I think that there's a couple really important things to think on here is in my sessions, a lot of time there's typically a multi-cue mix. For anyone who doesn't know what that means, it means that there's a cue box that has multiple faders or knobs that are giving you independent controls over different levels. So like maybe the drums have their own knob and the bass has its own knob or the synth patch has its own knob and the vocals do. If you've got one of those systems and you're going to use it in your session, which you guys, let me ask this. Are you guys using multi-cue systems in your recording sessions?
I love when you have multi-cue sessions, but a lot of that is going to be dependent on the studio you're working in and what their setup is. If you want to bring that in, that's a great thing to bring in, but often it's just a stereo mix. So what I try and do is break it out a little bit different where I have that level of control for them. But unfortunately, it's not an actual multi-cue. It's more just like a stereo mix plus.
For me, it depends on the artist. Like, it depends on how picky and how loud the artist needs their mix and in their headphones, because a lot of times I'll get artists that are like, it's too quiet and there's no way to get that and maintain audio quality without giving them some sort of separate mix from what's going on inside of here. So if I have the option, I would love to have a stemmed out mix for them where I could just jack up the fucking 808 and let them record over that and hear a distorted mess in their headphones because that's what they want. But on my end, I have everything where I need it.
Well, and here's the reason I asked that specific question is that one thing about multi-cue mix is you don't know what the fuck they're listening to.
Right.
And so like the amount of time whenever I'm using multi-cue systems, which is 99.9% of the time, is that I'm almost always having to go out and like try to pre-audition what someone's going to be listening to. So if we did a take and the singer's going like, I don't know, man, my headphones are kind of crazy. When they go in the control room to listen to the mix, I'm going to run out and set their cue mix up on the box for them so that they can basically get master volume up and down and little adjustments, but not trying to make their own blend per se because they're a musician. They're not a mixer.
Right. It does put a lot on the artist to have an understanding of things like creating a sub mix, understanding that by just turning all the things up louder and louder, that's not the best way to get more volume. There can be different things to communicate with the engineer about, bring this level up, but my overall level down. And you're right. It basically just puts a lot of understanding on the artist, which is not always the best if they're a creative person and they just want to concentrate on their performance.
Unless you don't tell them what the buttons do.
That's a good secret workaround.
To be fair, like if it's one of those big cue boxes, like I just tell them to only touch the master button. I'm like, I'll do the rest.
Right.
You just touch this, and like I'll make sure whatever you want, I'll get up and I'll walk in there and I'll set it the way you want it, but let me do it the right way so that everything's done in a way that will give us the best product, as opposed to just giving us the loudest thing from step 1 to step 2.
What makes you a good engineer? Deceit.
Yeah, I mean, to be fair, in a way, yes.
The long con is always in effect. Just lying, steadily building on other lies, making you for a fantastic engineer.
So here's the other cool thing to me about headphone mixes, and it kind of launches into a secondary territory, is headphone mixes are one, just so people can hear themselves in the track, but it's also about getting them excited and getting them to feel more creative. So a lot of times I'll be auditioning ways of making stuff sound better or more creative or coming up with new ideas in the control room, and maybe not saying to the headphones until I've got some really great or really advanced or good version of that idea. And I'll send it to them, and that person's way more excited. Like with drums, I might cut parallel compression, and on take 1, it's not in there. And by take 2, it's kind of turned up and it feels meatier and cooler.
We talked about some of this back in the auto-tune episode about like, does a singer want to have that effect on them because it's helping them creatively put down a different type of performance? And I can definitely see that by thinking about the headphone mix and how you could be trying out creative options that maybe aren't all the way there yet. You're just working through them and saving it to where you find it's something good. But then when you're like, hey, this is really going to punch up that last take, you can shoot it to them. Also, something I do a lot of times when we're doing vocal takes particularly is if they've been working on one part and it's going really good together, and this is kind of a cheat move, but it has often generated good results, is when they're on the verge of a really good take, when they're like, all right, one more, you got it. Just getting a little bit more high end on the vocal and maybe just a little bit more volume on that very next take. So their voice sounds actually like a little bit more exciting for that take.
Right.
And in turn, they will perform it just a little bit better and a little bit more exciting. And you're like, oh, that was the one. And then you got to turn it back down and just put them back in regular mode so that you don't waste that energy and you can kind of pull it back in. It's a little tricky, but sometimes it can create really good results, keeping that lie theme to your artist going, which is very important for engineering.
And I think in the concept of getting the best performance out of them, if someone's less trained, effects help so much, because a lot of times they're going to be a lot more nervous getting into the booth and a lot more hesitant. And a thing that makes you way less hesitant and afraid to be hesitant is a delay that's timed to the beat. So like an eighth delay literally fixes people's timing.
Yeah.
Like if I put an eighth delay on someone's vocal and I have it just loud enough, they'll use that to get into the natural rhythm of the song, which helps a lot.
I've done that with drummers when like they're maybe not the best player to a click track, but I need the infrastructure of a grid or something in the song. Throw some eighth note delay on there. So like, you know, your drum pattern now has some repetition that, well, it's forcing them to play to a metronome because that's a set time. Right? The metronome becomes themselves. So it's not quite a metronome track, but it's basically making them function like it. If you're saying like, I want an eighth note delay at 120 BPM, how's that different than a click at that point?
That's a great, what do you, the very transient stuff, the snare and the kick, maybe something like that? Is
Usually
that what you try and feed them?
Snare. Mostly because the snare has enough high end that it's going to cut through the song and it's not going to muddy up the arrangement. But it's also going to give them just enough to feel like that they can swing with that they can play along with it and have it be pleasant and enjoy it. Where a kick can sometimes give you some weird shit, you know?
Yeah, that's great. That's a great idea.
But I think that also that's the fun part of the job for me, and maybe some other people would disagree with this, is that I think that there's a lot of space to be creative as a tracking engineer.
Well, it's interesting because I know we were talking about being creative too, but all the tips you have just given me are really like functional creative ones because you've been concentrating on what is going to make the artists themselves be creative. Right. And I love that because you're never thinking about your own creative choices, which a lot of times as an engineer, that's going to be more brought in on the mixing side of things. But every creative choice you made, and they definitely are creative, is aimed at helping the artist be creative.
Yep.
And I actually really like that. And we were talking earlier, and I was surprised you were going to go that direction, but I love those choices. I think that really is always going to make for the best performance on a record. And like I said, when you're tracking, that's your goal, is make the best possible performance get recorded.
Well, and I'm thinking a lot of it because I think there's a lot of people that think that tracking engineering can become boring. Well, that's a prison of your own fucking making. So every session, I'm trying to do something new, but that's just me.
And I think I live in a different world than both of y'all when it comes to being creative while you record, because in the world of rap where I do most of my recording, there's often not a producer in the room.
Right.
Right on.
In the world that I'm living in, like specifically me and Thug, when we work, a lot of the times there's a producer that comes in, will drop off beats, hang out for a little, talk about some stuff, and then leave. And then, 4 a.m. rolls around and we start recording and we'll knock out 3 or 4 songs, whatever. But it's me and him in the room, and he's looking at me being like, what next? What should we do next? Or can you do anything to make this a little bit more crazy on the vocal processing side? Like adding harmonies or doing stuff like that. Like that's falling into my lap as an engineer. And yes, technically it's production, but in the newer methods of recording and the digital power that we have now, there's so much ability to do more than just get a solid vocal take and a good recording. And I feel like, given the way that the engineer, producer, artist relationship has changed, there is so much space to be very, very creative as a tracking engineer, at least in between the recording and rough mixing stages, getting it ready to go to the next step.
So then you go right into, from all the work you've done on the tracking side, but maybe before it goes off to final mixing, about the rough mix and how you think about wanting to build that up. A lot of times when people ask me about mostly being a mix engineer, they're like, what's the best way to become a mix engineer? And I tell them the same thing every single time. Become a good tracking engineer that spends time on their rough mix as well. Because not only do you get to try out all your creative ideas, you also get that instant feedback from your client in the session right then and there. Yep. And you see all the stuff that works, and then you try out some other stuff, and like maybe routinely that other thing doesn't work. And you're like, all right, that's not a great idea. And now as a mixer, if you get a project later, go with the hits first and see where that takes you. So spending that time with the rough can be really important.
Well, and I've had varying situations. You know what I mean? I've had artists that come in and they're like, do your thing. We're recording. They don't know me at all, but they just want to see what I'm capable of. So they'll come in and be like, yeah, do whatever. Take 30 minutes, 40 minutes, try something. And I'll do my best and hopefully impress them and hopefully get a new client for down the road. But then I've also had clients that are like, I have an engineer. I'm paying you for today because he's busy. Don't touch anything. Record the vocal and send it to this person. And that's it. And I'm happy to do both. Obviously, one makes me a little happier because there's a level of trust being built. There's a potential of new work down the line. But if you're telling me that today is the one day we're working and that's it, I'm going to record the best vocal I can, try and get the best performance I can, and prepare it the best way I can for your engineer. And then after the end of it, I'm just going to put my hands in there and go home and not take that session home with me. You know what I mean?
Yeah, for sure. And I think the thing with rough mixing, and I'd be curious where you guys take on, is for me, I start rough mixing the moment I hear sound from the session. I'm doing it all fucking day long. So even if I'm tracking something that has no backtracks, everything is completely being generated in the room, I am rough mixing that the whole fucking time. We're cutting vocals, I'm rough mixing.
Yeah, I think that's the best way to do it, because to your point about being creative earlier, if you're building the mix as you go, especially if you're working in the box scenario so that it's able to be passed on, but this could be true if you were on the decks too. But either way, if you're building the sound as you go, it's sounding more and more like a record while people were recording additional parts, and therefore they're being more and more confident in, hey man, I can hear that this is going to sound like a record. Let me perform even better. So those are great creative choices that still help the performance move right along.
When it comes to rough mixing and when you start, for me, that goes back to how prepared are you, and having your session prepped before they walk in, so you can have all of your effect sends there, even if there's just a blank reverb and you want to tweak it later. Like having a couple reverb sends, a few delay sends, a couple of just like I have one called like just Toolbox, and it has 10 different plugins, all inactive, that I like to go to in the end game to do something crazy. And so as I'm going, there's like an EQ, a compressor, a de-esser, bare minimum on one of the vocal auxes. And as it's going, I'm tweaking that up and getting it kind of in the right pocket as far as like what sounds good to me. And then I'll maybe add a little reverb or add an eighth delay, and then start adding delay throws and start adding effect sends and start going into harmonies and, adding like any sort of modulation or like distortion, whatever I need to do. That's going as I'm going. And then by the time the artist is leaving the booth, there's an idea there. You know what I mean? And then that gives me 15, 20 minutes after they're done to kind of get it more in the ballpark. But then by the time that they walk out, they could put that song out most of the time. And a lot of times they do.
Well, and I think you just nailed it on why all of these skills make you good, and why beyond just being, I'm a good track engineer, why it's important is that I'm hoping that if I track it and they hear my rough in the room, all they're going to think about for the next 3 weeks is like, fuck, that sounds so good when I was at the studio. God, we got this other guy to mix it and it's not as good anymore. So like, we've got to go back and, hire the guy who made the rough. And like, I've gotten hired hundreds of times from that exact situation, is that they're sitting there, they're jamming the rough, they're like vibing with it. And that if you're looking through this whole system of how to set up the tracking session to be really functional, but really creative, and that by the end of it, you've got a great rough, now you're probably going to get hired or considered for the mix.
Well, obviously, that interaction with the rough and how people think it sounds is going to be something that mix engineers need to consider when projects come to them. That's probably a big part of being prepared as a mix engineer too, is when you get a project, who is your client? And what did they like about the rough? How are you going to incorporate that in your final preparation? And like, how can you build on top of it if that's what they're looking for, versus do they want a totally new approach? And I guess this is when you start thinking about, as a mix engineer, how do you prepare and how are you good in that arena?
Right.
And I think I was lucky enough to kind of skip the line, as it were, where I didn't record for, 4 or 5 years before I started mixing. I was recording after I assisted for 2.5 years, which gave me a very good, base knowledge and got all of my, basics in line. And then when I got into the world of recording, I started thinking, what could I be doing that other engineers aren't doing? And I started working on my rough mixes, and those turned into mix jobs, which turned into, a whole new career path for me, which I thought was 10 years down the line, because that's what I thought was the process. But the more work you put in and the more prepared you are, the more ready you are to kind of show your skills off, the more you're going to advance your career faster. And this was going to be a 1-part episode talking about recording and mixing and what it takes to be good at what you're doing. But it looks like this is going to end up being a 2-part one. So come back after the break to catch part 2 of episode 8, What Makes an Engineer Good.